Cities Skylines 2 has been out for just over a week now, so here's a bunch of things that I like and some things that I don't like about the game so far. For anyone that's new here, I'm still fairly new to Cities Skylines myself. I only started playing in March of this year, but I've played pretty intensively since then, so I feel like I have a fairly good idea of the mechanics of the game and how Cities Skylines 2 differs from the first game. I haven't made it that far into the game yet because some of the milestones take a really long time to get to, so this is kind of an unfinished list. It's more of my initial impressions of the game from having played it a little bit so far. And on 2 maps so far, Tampere, which is based on a city in Finland, and Barrier Island, which reminds me a little bit of Long Island in New York. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is roads. Obviously the road tool has had a massive overhaul since the first game, and a lot of the mod tools that everyone uses have been integrated into the base vanilla game, which is great, but I will say personally they have a lot of drawbacks. Building intersections is so much easier and so much smoother and cleaner than in Cities Skylines 1. The ways that the roads join up with each other and change the decals and make lane rules is so much more satisfying now to just build roads, and with the advanced road tool, having the ability to pick which decorative features and rules to put on individual roads is helpful in some situations, but I wish there was a way of applying it to a whole road before placing it, because doing it piece by piece is so time consuming. The general road tools are so much more advanced than the first game, and while this can be really helpful for some things, I have found a few drawbacks. I actually found it really difficult to make a perfect grid, even on completely flat land, because of how precise these road tools are. I placed and removed the same grid about 20 times before eventually giving up and using the grid tool and then adding roads to it, because I couldn't get one small enough where the zoning tiles were actually sticking to both sides of the road on the corner. In a lot of cases, they only stuck to one side of the road, and you'd have to remove one of the roads to get them to be on the right road and then place it back in again after the buildings have zoned in. I'm sure this will be something that I'll get used to over time, but to begin with, it's a little bit off-putting when it takes so long just to get something to look how you want it to look. And when everything moves so fast in this game, you either have to have it on pause for ages or have it running in the background and risk missing things and stuff going wrong. Some of my favourite road features though are the sunken roads. I really like the retaining walls and how you can put other roads over the top of them. I think that'll be really handy for building quite complex intersections, especially in inner cities. Before, we just had the kind of jagged terrain edge that didn't always look very good, and you had to try and use keys, which meant there was loads of nodes sitting next to each other. So that is a huge improvement. Another thing is using slightly raised roads as keys, as they have retaining walls around them. I've used this tip on different levels of terrain inland, and I've also used it on the shore. I'm not sure whether there's some sort of bug on the Barrier Island map, but I could not get the road to join up in the middle. It kept saying that it was on water, and no matter how much I extended the land out with the terrain tools, it wouldn't stop saying that it was on water, so I had to kind of scrap what I was doing and do a different road plan instead and make a faux bay of sorts. I'm assuming that this is some sort of bug, and I wonder if anyone else has experienced this, but as you can see here, it just wasn't having it. It did lead me on to using pedestrian bridges though, and I really love these bridge styles. But I wish that when you joined it to a raised road, it got rid of the barrier around the edge of the road so it looked like people could actually walk through there. I don't know whether this is supposed to be like this or whether it's just something that they forgot to remove, but I haven't sat and watched to see if anyone does walk across it yet, so it might be that people just can't walk from a raised road to a bridge, but they snap onto each other, so you'd assume that they can. But either way, it looks really, really great, and it's definitely going to add a little bit more variety to the cities. Something else that I really love is the fact that we can make long junctions now. Previously, the junctions wouldn't work if you try and place 2 junctions too close to each other, but in Cities Skylines 2, they seem to join up and create a rather long intersection, and I really like this. I think it's a lot more realistic. You get a lot of these in the UK on busy roads, and if you space it out right, you can still get the full amount of zoning tiles either side of the junction. But if you do it too short, sometimes you do get these blank spots in the corners, so you just have to kind of think ahead to that. But it really helps with reducing the amount of nodes and conflict points and makes the traffic flow feel a lot more natural. And speaking of traffic flow and things feeling more natural, There are so few cars on the road when you first start the game. I think this is something that I'll just have to get used to, but it did feel really weird to begin with, hardly having any cars driving about. And the same goes for pedestrians as well. There aren't that many people walking around on the pavements or standing outside shops. And I can completely see what Diana was saying in her early access videos when she said that the cities don't really feel like they have any life to them. This makes total sense because the game is so detailed. From a distance you can't really see much, and because the colours are so much more muted and so much more realistic, you don't get those super brightly coloured cars or super brightly coloured Sims walking around that you really have to look for signs of life. Like I said, this is probably something that I'll get used to over time, but I'm definitely a fan of some of the extra things that this has brought, which brings me on to my second category of things that I like, which is risky behaviour. The new Sim AI is a huge improvement on the previous game, and there's a few things that I noticed that I thought were bugs to begin with, but I reckon it's actually part of the risk calculation that the AI does for the Sims. One of these things is jaywalking. Jaywalking isn't really a thing in the UK, so I'm sure it's not that much of a big deal to people who come from places where jaywalking is completely legal. But I noticed that when I was removing the crosswalk off of one of the intersections in my first build, people were still crossing the road, and I thought it was a bug to begin with. I was getting really annoyed, I was putting it in and removing it again, thinking that I must have done something wrong. And then I realised that the people were actually walking partway across the road and then stopping in between the lanes and waiting for there to be a gap for them to get across the rest of the road. And I love this detail. This is so realistic, and it's actually really helpful because it will show you where the most common routes of travel are. And then you can put in things like crosswalk bridges or tunnels to get people off of that intersection, reduce traffic and reduce the risk of accidents. And speaking of accidents, they are a great addition to the game. Even though you do get the occasional car that will drive through another one, you do get accidents that happen on intersections, or cars will spin off in wet or snowy conditions, and it adds to the realism. But I will say there is one huge drawback to these accidents, and that is the response time of emergency vehicles. They drive as if they don't have a care in the world. But the police cars and fire engines, when they're responding to these accidents, drive so slowly. There's no urgency like there is in the first game or even in the trailers for Cities Skylines 2. I don't know whether this is a bug and something they might need to fix in a patch update, but it has caused a few traffic issues in my city so far where accidents have happened, so no one can get through those intersections, and the response vehicles take such a long time to get there that it just clogs everything up. So if they can fix that issue of emergency response vehicles being really slow, the road traffic accidents and risky behaviours will probably be one of my favourite elements of the game. Speaking of routing, that's the third category of things that I want to talk about in Cities Skylines 2. Compared to Cities Skylines 1, the routing in this game is incredible. This has been talked about quite a lot, so I'm not going to go over all of the routing points that everyone's been talking about, but there's a few little details that I've noticed that I'm particularly fond of. Watching cars actually drive from one place to another rather than them just disappearing and spawning in a car park space, for example, that brings me so much joy. Sometimes they do turns in the road if they can't get to where they're going to, and if they're going to a parking space in a car park, they will actually drive up to the space and pull into it rather than just floating across the grass like they do in Cities Skylines 1. The cars will also now cross traffic to get into assets on the other side of the road, which wasn't very common in Cities Skylines 1. Another small detail is things like alleyways and high density buildings. Cars and pedestrians need to actually be able to reach where they're going to, so a lot of the assets will have these little alleyways through the middle if the parking spaces are out the back, and some will even need multiple access points. This again is a really small detail, but it goes to show how much they've thought about the little things in Cities Skylines 2. I have mixed feelings about the asset design in general. I'm not a fan of the low density housing appearance. I feel like the fences and the borders on the lots are too harsh, and it only really looks good on square roads. And anyone who's watched my videos before knows that I like doing quite sprawling builds, and it's not really lending itself to that so far. But I'm sure that's something that will be fixed over time with more DLCs and content creator packs and the workshop. I really like the commercial asset details though. Some of them, if they're placed on a corner, look like you can actually get in on multiple sides because of the pavement detailing and car parks. I've also noticed that people have favourite shops sometimes, I haven't seen anyone else talk about this, but I've noticed in both of my builds so far that sometimes commercial assets will get little hearts over them, and then when you zoom in, there's loads and loads of people standing waiting outside and kind of flocking to the shop. I love this detail. I think it adds to the realism, although I can't see any connection to it in like the Twitter feed or any of the other pop-ups that come up, so you kind of have to just be on the lookout for it at all times. I wish there was some sort of connection to like online hype. There may be, and I just missed it, but that little social media thing tends to move so fast that it would be easy to miss something. When it comes to the facility buildings, I like the details and the additional roads that they have within the lots, but some of them are just too big. Some of them make sense. I think the secondary school and the college make sense to be the size they are because, at least in the UK, secondary schools tend to have quite large buildings and large grounds because they have lots and lots of students. But the cemetery, I feel like that's been scaled totally wrong. And because you unlock it really early in the game, you need so much space to be able to put it down, and depending on how you start your city, you may end up with more gravestones than citizens, which is a little bit off to me. The upgrades also add to the size of the cemetery, and I think it is just a little bit too much in my opinion. I think they should have smaller rural cemeteries as an option, because you tend to get those in inner cities or in the centre of towns. Having a second option would be really helpful. Another option for the cemetery is to be able to draw it like you can with the landfill or with these specialised industry areas. This would make a lot more sense because you're not going to have that many people dying to begin with, and you can just scale it with your city in the same way that you can with those other assets. I do really like the upgrades. It's taking a while to get used to because this just wasn't a thing in Cities Skylines 1, and I'm having to learn the size of all of the additional upgrade buildings so that I can build around it and leave space. But I'm sure the more I play the game, the easier it will be to kind of do that intuitively and to know how much space to leave for things. I really like the mix of parks that we have. I'm a park girly and it's something that I really love in Cities Skylines 1, but sometimes I do feel like some of the parks are too big. Sometimes you want a really nice small park to be able to fit in a city corner, but all of the vanilla ones are really big. One of my dislikes about the parks though is they feel a little bit flat. When you're really zoomed in, they do actually have detail to them, like the paving stones and the trees and the grass. But when you're looking at it from a distance, it just looks very cartoonish and very square to me. Whereas with Cities Skylines 1, we had the ruined edges. And while I didn't always like that, it added some dimension to the parks and made them feel a little bit more worn and a bit more used. I guess Cities Skylines 2 just feels a little bit clinical at the moment with how harsh everything is. And I also wish that we could use the pathway tool to extend the parks like we can in Cities Skylines 1. That was one of my favourite things to do to fill spaces and to make the cities more walkable and to get people using green spaces, but that's just not going to be possible in this game, and that's kind of disappointing to me. Another thing that's a little bit disappointing is the fact that snow doesn't cover concrete or grass. It's kind of understandable on the roads because they would most likely be shoveled in real life, but there's no snow even around the edges of the concrete on the assets. If you're really zoomed in, you may not even notice that it snowed until you zoom all the way out, and then it just looks a little bit jarring. But other than that, I'm a big fan of the weather and environment. I have mixed feelings about the fact that you can't turn it off, but I like how the weather and the environment interact with each other, like the clouds leaving shadows on the map, and the rain and snow making the roads more slippery, causing more accidents. And I particularly love the way that the water looks in the winter. It's such a beautiful, crisp blue, and the movement of the caustics is just so realistic. I've never really been a fan of playing in winter, and I will admit that even though I have the Snowfall DLC for Cities Skylines 1, I've never actually played with it. But I think I like it in Cities Skylines 2 because the details are just so beautiful, as is the sunlight. I think this is one of my favourite environmental details because of the sun rays and the bokeh or bokeh, however you pronounce that. It interacts so beautifully with the camera angle and also changes due to the season as well, and that is so realistic. However, my next topic interacts with the weather and environment in what I feel is a negative way sometimes, and that is time. Compared to Cities Skylines 1, this game moves extremely slowly, and it's a little bit jarring to begin with. I couldn't quite wrap my head around the new scale of time in Cities Skylines 2, and it's definitely taking a while to get used to how that impacts some of the aspects of the game. Like education takes much longer to run through, ground pollution takes such a long time to disappear, and upgrade levels are extremely slow. For example, in my first build, it's been running through for about 8 months in game, and only 2 buildings are at level 5, and both of those are specialised industry. The houses in commercial are nowhere near level 5, and it seems to be a much more complex process. I think the thing that's most jarring for me is that the player progression is so fast compared to Cities Skylines 1, where you can unlock milestones without even placing a single house, you get access to facilities at a much earlier stage, and you can start expanding with new tiles a lot sooner. But the civilian progression is so much slower. It takes months in game for them to just get through elementary school, and even down to little details like the trees growing. It's kind of a little bit jarring that you've got 2 different speeds of progression going, and to me, they don't quite match up yet. Another thing that's been really hard to wrap my head around is balancing the budget. I don't think I've been making a profit in either of my builds so far for a single second. The service upkeep charges are so much more expensive than Cities Skylines 1, and I know that we start with more budget, but it seems impossible to reach equilibrium, let alone make a profit. Balancing imports and exports for materials is really hard, and even though we get specialised industry in the base game, and we get more different types of industry, there does seem to be a bit of a mismatch with the industry to commercial demand, because the commercial still spawns in randomly. Unless you sit and delete buildings as they come in if it's not the right type, you kind of just have to wait to see what commercial buildings spawn in and then adjust the industry for that, or vice versa. And the commercial and industry demand bars on the bottom of the screen could be sitting completely maxed out that whole time, but they may only want one specific type of commercial or industry. A bit like the taxes, it seems like it's a much more nuanced, complex system, but there doesn't seem to be a way to actually combat that yet. But for now, I'm still struggling to make a profit, and I genuinely don't see how I'm going to get anywhere with this town if I can't balance that right. I do really like how you can tweak specific things in the taxes panel though, and you can set different tax rates for different education levels. That is a really good addition. And I also really like how you can adjust the ticket price for different public transport routes, which takes us on quite nicely to my next topic, which is of course public transport. Anyone who's watched my videos before knows that public transport is one of my favourite things about Cities Skylines. I love making robust and efficient public transport routes and using a variety of different methods to get people from one place to another. But I will say in Cities Skylines 2, I'm not loving it as much as I thought I would. From the trailers, I was getting really excited with the changes that they were making. I haven't tried out every method of public transport yet. I've only done buses and trains, so I won't speak on any of the other methods, but I definitely have some thoughts about these two. I have a population of around 13,000 in my first build, and the bus averages around 4 users. In Cities Skylines 1, you couldn't put enough vehicles on to cater for the demand, but the second game seems to have the complete opposite problem. I've tried adjusting the routes and the ticket prices, and still no one seems to be using it. Trains are similar in my experience. I do get a few more people coming in on the trains from other cities, but nowhere near as many as you'd get in Cities Skylines 1. I also have a lot more people leaving the city in Cities Skylines 2, which is a little bit disappointing, but this may just be a change in the way that the AI works. I'm also going to touch on the fact that the stations are huge. You have to put aside so much space for the train stations, and the depot is even bigger. It's great that they have multiple lines going through them, but not every train station is going to need that. I'm hoping the public transport gets better as the city grows, but at the moment, if I'm honest, I am finding it a little bit hard to get the motivation to try with public transport, because the growth is both really fast and really slow at the same time, and the city is constantly wanting expansions. So setting aside room for these huge stations and depots adds a huge amount of stress onto the planning. This might be something that gets easier with more experience playing with the game, and there might be things that they add to future patches and DLCs that make it a little bit smoother, but I've got to say, I think it's my biggest disappointment in Cities Skylines 2 so far. To end this video on a positive, I just want to reiterate how much I love the weather and the environment in this game. I was able to take the most beautiful footage of my city, and I think if they can get little things like detailing and props fixed, then it's going to be an incredible game. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I haven't got that far through the game yet, so these are just my initial thoughts, but if you agree or disagree with any of the things that I've said, let me know in the comments, and I'll probably do a follow-up video once I get a little bit further in. I'm definitely going to be doing some Let's Plays and city builds once I get a little bit more familiar with the game, so let me know if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see.